This is going to be notes number 15. I don't know why the background is all of a sudden pink, but I don't know. Like it or not like it, doesn't matter. But anyway, the question for today is, how do plants survive in different environments? So we're going to look at a couple different types of plants and how they adapt to be able to survive wherever they grow. I was going to say live, but they grow. If you're doing the handwritten notes, you're going to have your name up here at the top. Again, the title is Plant Adaptations. This is notes number 15, and then your divider line with your topic on the left and details on the right. So first we're going to review what an adaptation is. Adaptations are the characteristics or physical traits of a plant, in this case, that help it survive in its ecosystem. There are many different kinds of plant adaptations for different environments. If you remember back in the just this last unit, the organisms and environment, I think, we talked about different adaptations for animals. For example, camels have adapted with their hump. They can store fat and nutrients and things they can use when in the desert. Therefore, if there's a drought or they're not able to get to water or food for a long period of time, they can still survive. They also have those really long eyelashes to help block the sand from blowing into their eyes. So all kinds of examples of adaptations for animals. But in this case, we're going to talk about different adaptations of plants because let's be honest, there are tons and tons of different kinds of plants that live in different environments, and they all have to be able to survive in different ways. Plants must survive in many different types of conditions and environments. In order to survive and thrive, they must adapt. Okay, they must make the changes to be able to survive. They still need three things: water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide to live. But in some places, it's not as easy to get those. For example, in the desert, it's hard to get water. Underwater plants, it's hard to get sunlight. If you live in a really overcrowded area, it might be hard to get carbon dioxide or live. If the plants grow in a really crowded area, that might be hard to get carbon dioxide. So in each of these situations, the plants have to adapt. So at the top, first thing we're talking about is the definition. Again, if you've printed off the notes, just fill in the blanks from the information on the slides. But if you're doing the handwritten version, the first thing that we're reviewing is the definition of adaptations. They are characteristics or physical traits of a plant that help it survive in its ecosystem. And then plants must adapt to get three things: the water, sunlight, and CO2 that they need to live. Okay, first category, desert plants. These are plants obviously that grow in the desert, which you may think it's not possible for plants to grow in the desert, but remember that a desert climate is not necessarily big rolling hills of sand dunes like we normally think of, but any kind of area where there's less than a certain amount of rain per year. It's just very, very dry and not a whole lot of water in that area. So these kinds of plants have special adaptations for getting and conserving water. This word right here means getting it and keeping it until they need it. Okay, so typically plants dry out pretty easily, right? If you've ever had a garden or tried to grow flowers in a pot or plant something, you know that if you don't water it for a long period of time, eventually the flowers begin to wilt and the plant begins to die. So plants that grow in the desert have to have special adaptations to be able to get the water and then keep it without them drying out. One of the things they do is they have what we call fleshy leaves, stems, or roots. Basically, this just means they're really thick. They have a lot of kind of like stuff on the inside. If you've ever interacted with a succulent plant or an aloe plant, something like that, they have very thick kind of leaves that are made of a lot of substance. They don't like bend and blow in the breeze like an oak leaf or a maple leaf. They're typically very thick and fleshy is what we call it. And these fleshy leaves, stems, and roots store lots of water. For example, the main example of that would be succulents, okay? Very popular nowadays. They look something like this. Sometimes there's little mini ones that look like this. I've had some in my classroom before, and people love to have these indoors because they really don't require a whole lot of upkeep. You water them like once a week and they're good to go. These types of plants must absorb large quantities of water in short periods because the water only comes every once in a while. Desert rains are light and brief, only wetting the top few centimeters of the soil. Another adaptation they have is they have shallow roots that spread out extensively, okay? So what we mean by that is this. If this were the plant, okay, so you see obviously in this picture, this saguaro cactus here, okay? Normally plants have roots that, kind of grow deep down into the soil, maybe a little bit out, but for the most part, they grow down to get to the water and nutrients that are hidden in the dirt below. Well, desert plants, their roots actually, they don't grow down necessarily, they grow out. Okay, they're very shallow and their roots reach far, 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 far. And the reason for that is this. When it rains in the desert and the water falls onto the soil or the sand, depending on where it is, it never really goes very deep. Okay, so it's never, so in my picture that I'm drawing here, the water's not necessarily going to sink down to this depth of the water because it will probably be dried up by then. So the roots don't need to reach all the way down here. So instead, they reach far, 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 far to be able to absorb as much of the water as they can. So for example, this is another picture of a saguaro cactus, I believe. Pretty commonly seen in Texas, especially in Arizona, New Mexico, places like that. But you can see here that the roots are very extensive. Okay, they don't necessarily, I'm trying to find a color I can draw with it. You'll see. Okay, I'll try purple. They don't necessarily drop deep down this way, but you can see they reach super far out to the side. Okay, this is the cactus up here that's been knocked over. Okay, so that's just another type of example that they have to be able to survive in these dry climates. Another way they can adapt is they will live far apart from each other in order to reduce competition for water in the soil. If you think about it, normally we see plants that grow pretty close to each other. Okay, trees are not typically very far apart. Bushes, flower plants, all kinds of different things. Typically, you can't put them like right next to each other, obviously, but they don't have to be super far apart from each other. Well, for example, the plants like the saguaro cactus or really any other kind of desert plant, they never grow into like a forest. Instead, they're very sparse and they pop up all over the desert. Okay, far apart from each other. The reason for that is this. There's only so much water within this area. Okay, let's pretend this one blue box I just drew represents water for this cactus. Okay, and then this guy, he gets all the water in this area. And this guy gets all of the water in this area. Instead of having, let's say there were multiple cacti, okay, now I'm drawing on purple, there were multiple of them growing close to each other, right? There's not enough water for all of these cacti to get what they need to survive. So, desert plants grow very far apart from each other so that there's not any competition. Okay, now this one little cactus gets all of that water in the area. So that's another way they can adapt to survive. Another thing they can do, or they may have, is their stems and leaves, especially of succulent plants, have what we call waxy cuticles. Okay, the best way to describe waxy cuticles is if you've ever had like a cut or like an open wound on your skin, and maybe someone helps you put Vaseline or Neosporin or something on there, kind of that wet jelly-like stuff. Um, that the reason why they do that is that makes that wound waterproof, right? Nothing's able to get in, nothing's able to get out. It kind of protects any foreign substance from getting into that wound and infecting it. That's kind of the same thing that these waxy cuticles do, okay? It's like a thick waxy kind of covering that covers the leaves and the stems so that they are almost waterproof when the stomata, or the little leaves, or the little pores on the sides of the leaves and stems are closed. So when these waxy cuticles act very much like Neosporin or Vaseline, like I was saying, or petroleum jelly, you may call it, in that they don't allow water to get in, but they also don't allow water to get out, which is important. If it's just rained in the desert and the cacti are able to absorb it, they want to keep the water inside of them for as long as possible. So in an environment where the temperatures reach like, 100 degrees or even more up from there, okay, 105, 110, it would the water would evaporate from these plants very quickly. But because of that waxy covering that acts like the neosporin or the Vaseline or petroleum jelly, it keeps everything inside. So the water doesn't evaporate, and therefore the plant can use it longer. Another adaptation, some desert plants will not produce leaves, but instead they produce spines to protect themselves, okay? And to protect themselves from animals eating them, okay? They don't have leaves they can just grow back, right? Instead they grow these spines all over themselves. Much like a pufferfish or a porcupine, they use that to protect themselves. Uh, Living in Texas, you've probably interacted with cactus spines before. This right here is a picture of my thumb. Okay, this is me. A year or two ago, some friends and I went on a trip to Granbury, Texas, and we went hiking. And I can't remember if I like touched the cactus or what I did, but it was not. I don't think I fell. I think I just touched it for funsies, but it was not very forgiving. I mean, you can see it, just a tiny touch got tons of spines stuck in there. And I had to yank them all out, and it was not very exciting. But that was my first experience with just how sharp and how quickly these things can stick you. So that's another adaptation they have to protect themselves from destructive human beings like myself. So for the handwritten notes, I made my topic over here desert plants, and then on the right, I listed all the different kinds I just went over. They have fleshy leaves, stems, and roots to store the water because it doesn't rain often in the desert. They have shallow roots that spread out as opposed to growing deep into the soil, for example, the saguaro cactus. They live far apart to reduce competition for nutrients, both water and food. And their stems and leaves have waxy cuticles, which makes them almost waterproof, so that the water will stay in the plant for as long as possible. Next category we're going to talk about is the tundra. Before I get into the adaptations for plants in the tundra, I want to briefly review what the tundra is. This is the coldest of all the biomes. We've talked about it a little bit before, but just because it's good to know. The soil in the tundra is permanently frozen, okay? Because it's so cold in these areas, any of the water that is in the dirt or the soil, it's typically frozen pretty much constantly. There's very low temperatures and also very low rainfall. It doesn't rain a whole lot in the tundra. I would assume if it does, it would snow, but still, it doesn't rain very much. There are really stiff winds that sweep across the land constantly, especially the higher you get in elevation, or going high up mountains or things like that, the wind can get pretty intense. So many types of plants that we are used to would not survive there because they would get blown away. They're just not strong enough to be able to withstand that. So because of all these things, there's not a whole lot of variety of plant life in the tundra because again, it's a very harsh environment. Examples of the tundra, like as far as areas, are the polar ice cap. Okay, so like North Pole, South Pole, Antarctica, Arctic Circle, things like that. Tundra, the word tundra, is actually a Finnish word that means treeless. And this is actually kind of a cool fact. If this were, let's say I drew the mountain like this, it's a very steep mountain, obviously. Okay, the trees can grow at lower elevations. Okay, so trees, kind of foresty, etc. But there comes a point on the mountain where the trees no longer grow because the environment is not conducive for that. That is called the tree line, actually, of the mountain. So I could draw like a little dotted line right here. And that could be considered the tree line. It's not actually a line, but if you look at any kind of a mountain in either Colorado or over in Europe, things like that, you can actually see where the green stops and where either the gray of the mountain or just the dirt or even the white of the snow and ice starts. So in the tundra, though, that would be this area where the trees cannot grow because it's just too harsh. So how do plants grow then? Well, there are small plants that will grow close to the ground in order to keep warm, okay? They want to avoid the wind blowing all over their bodies, so they'll typically grow closer to the ground to kind of keep themselves warm. Also, because there's not a whole lot of sunlight up in the tundra, or like think North Pole or Canada, Alaska, Antarctica, because there's not a whole lot of sunlight or even heat from the sun, oftentimes the flowers in the tundra will be dark colored, like what you see in this picture here. The reason for that is, as we know, dark colors attract sunlight. So these dark colored flowers are attempting to absorb more heat from the sun. That way they can, the dark color will help kind of pull the sunlight in. Sometimes they also have fuzzy stems. Like if you look at their stem, they're actually pretty fluffy. And they provide protection from wind and traps. Oh, protection from wind and traps the heat to keep it close to the surface of the plant. Exactly the same way you would put on a jacket if it's cold outside. Okay, these stems have kind of fur covering their bodies. Some plants even have dish-like flowers, so they're kind of almost like bowl-shaped, and they track the sun, but the dish shape allows more sun to be focused on the center of the flower. So that disc shape is kind of funneling all the sunlight towards the center of the flower. Here are a few more examples. You can see in this picture, you can see really, and this one, you can see the fuzzy stems really well. Obviously, it looks like they would be a little bit warmer. So, but that is obviously the point. It acts very much like fur on an animal or a jacket on a human. This right here is an example of the Arctic poppy, and this is a good example of that disc shape. You can see it's kind of cupped, basically. It looks like it's facing the sun, but that cupped shape kind of funnels all of the sunlight inward towards the center, like it almost acts like a mirror and kind of reflects it all towards the middle. A couple other adaptations they have. Some plants just flat out won't even come alive until the summer when conditions are just right for their growth. They might just stay dormant during the winter months and only sort of like wake up in the summer when the conditions are more suitable for growing. Like I said, there are no trees in the tundra. The trees are not adapted for the harsh conditions in the soil, so they don't actually grow there. And then in general, because the soil is typically frozen all the time, plants that do grow in the tundra are actually unable to grow deep roots because, again, they can't really get past that block of ice. So if you're doing the handwritten notes, our topic here is the tundra plants. Up here, I put tundra with a colon. I just listed off some characteristics of the tundra that we talked about. It's very icy, it's cold, it's frozen, and then examples would be like the polar caps. And then below that, we have the adaptations. Small plants grow close to the ground for warmth. The fuzzy stems help to trap the heat. The dark colored flowers absorb heat from the sun. Some of the plants have dish-like flowers to track the sun and focus the sunlight to the center of the flower. Some of them will only come alive in the summer months. There are no trees at all, and the plants cannot grow deep roots, again, because of that frozen soil. Okay, next one. Water plant adaptations. Another word for that is aquatic plants. Okay. Aquatic plants carry on photosynthesis as well. They have to because they're plants. So they must live near the surface. Okay. Sunlight can only penetrate so far into the water. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. So in order for the plants to grow, they have to be able to reach as close to the surface as possible in order to gather the most sunlight possible. Another adaptation, I guess this could technically be another bullet point here. Their leaves and stems must be flexible to sway with the movement of the water. If you think about either seaweed or kelp or anything that you see, if you've ever seen that floating in the ocean, you know that the movement of the waves kind of causes the plants to have to, sway back and forth. Well, if the plant were a typical plant, that would cause damage to the stem, the structure, and eventually it would probably snap the plant. But aquatic plants, water plants, are actually adapted to be able to move and flow with the sway of the water. They also have what we call hold fasts, which does exactly what it sounds like. They hold the plant fast hold it fast, meaning keep it unmoving into the soil or maybe even the rock that it grows on. That's what it looks like over here at least. But you can see here in this picture the label hold fast right down here that I just circled. These are root-like structures which keep kelp plants anchored in shallow waters close to the shore. And then the last one on this slide at least, that I think is really cool are what they call air bladders. Okay, we mentioned with fish how they have a swim bladder that allows them to either float up or even sink down further, and they can kind of control that. Air bladders in plants work pretty much the same way. These air bladders help keep the kelp upright and nearer to the surface to gather sunlight. In the pod, I'm also going to have a video of a rainforest flower. One of those is going to be the Amazon water lilies. And they show you in that video that it's almost like there's little bubbles of air trapped inside the leaves. And if you've ever tried to, maybe you've had like a big beach ball at the pool, you try to like push it underwater and it somehow keeps pushing up back against you, right? That's because air naturally wants to rise to the surface to escape. It doesn't stay underwater very well. So these air bladders work just like balloons, and they kind of help pull the plant to the top of the surface of the water to get the sunlight and kind of help it float there. So you'll see a little bit more about that in the video. This is another good example, the bladderwort. This is, ooh, actually, I don't know if it's vascular or non-vascular, but the point of this picture is to show you the little air bubbles. So like here's one. You can't really see that color, can you? Here's one. You can't see that either. Here's, let's try this. There we go. There's a bubble. There's a bubble. There's an air bladder, an air bladder. Okay, so these kind of help the plant rise to the surface to be able to gather as much sunlight as possible. So to the topic, aquatic plants, they live near the surface to gather as much sunlight as possible. They have flexible stems so that they can sway in the water. They have holdfasts that are root-like structures that anchor the kelp plant. And lastly, they have air bladders that help keep the kelp upright and near to the surface. Okay, last category is plants in the rainforest. I know this has been a little bit longer, so hang in there, we're almost done. But it's cool. Anyways, rainforest plants that live in shady locations, such as in forests, struggle to find enough sunlight. So it's not dark in the rainforest, but as you can imagine, there is a very thick, what they call a canopy of trees. There's so much growth, so many plants, so many trees, that it almost creates like a tent almost over the ground, so that not as much light can get through as it would normally. So the plants that grow but beneath those trees typically have a pretty hard time getting enough sunlight. So one thing they'll do is they will climb taller plants like trees to get more sunlight. You can see that in this first picture up here, okay? The ivy plant is kind of climbing up the tree in order to try and reach the sunlight towards the top of the tree. Also, plants that live on the floor of rainforests also suffer from a lack of sunlight, like I just said. So to accommodate for that, the leaves of plants on the forest floor are typically very, very large in order to gather as much sunlight as possible. So if you're not going to get a whole lot of sunlight, one way to help with that is to make your leaves as big as possible, like what you see in the bottom picture here, so that any sunlight that does hit the leaf, it can gather because it can actually reach that sunlight, right? So the bigger the leaf, the more sunlight it can absorb. Also, many of these plants produce their fruits or produce their seeds inside of fruits. And that's good because A, it protects the seed, but B, it also helps attract animals that want to eat the fruit. And then the good news is that the plant seeds will then get scattered and have a chance to grow. Like we mentioned in the flower reproduction notes, whenever the fruit is either eaten or sometimes even just stomped on by an animal or somehow the seeds can get spread by that animal and that can help them reproduce in other areas. So last section here for the handwritten notes, the rainforest plants is the topic. They climb taller plants like trees in order to get more sunlight. I think I also have a cool video about that in the pod as well. The plants that live on the rainforest floor also struggle to get enough sunlight, so they grow very large leaves to absorb as much as possible. They also grow their seeds inside of fruits, which attract animal eaters, and then those animal eaters help to scatter them. Okay, these videos I'm including in the pod, except for 2 of them are just websites, so I'm not going to include those. But make sure you finish watching all the videos and then answer the question at the end. Other than that, make sure you're studying for your test, which again is going to be on Friday. Okay, make sure you're studying the study guide as well as your no, oh no, the plant classification chart. That will help you. Like I said, it's not going to be a fill in the blank chart or anything like that. So, but it will help you answer some of the questions if you know and understand that chart. So, but that's all I have for you today, and I will, quote unquote, see you tomorrow.